There's a particular British ghost story that doesn't bother with a figure in white or footsteps on the stairs. It just involves a skull. A real one, kept inside the house, because the people who lived there found out the hard way that getting rid of it brought the screaming back. And this isn't one house. It's a pattern. Wardley Hall in Greater Manchester has one. So does Tunstead Farm. So does Calgarth Hall up in the Lake District. But the most famous version of all of this sits inside a grand Elizabethan manor in Yorkshire called Burton Agnes Hall. Today we're looking at what happened the one time someone actually got to put a skull like this under a microscope. The legend said one thing, the lab said something nobody expected. Burton Agnes Hall went up between 1601 and 1610, built by Sir Henry Griffith to replace the older Norman house that had stood there for centuries. The story goes that Griffith had 3 daughters. The youngest, Anne, was attacked while the new hall was still under construction, survived the attack itself, but the fever that followed didn't let her recover. Dying, she asked her sisters for one thing: bring her head into the finished house when it's done, so some part of her gets to see it. They didn't do it. Anne went into the ground hole in the local churchyard, and the family moved into Burton Agnes without her. That's when things started happening. Crashes with no source, doors slamming shut on their own, footsteps moving fast down corridors nobody was standing in. Eventually the family gave up and did the thing they'd refused to do at the funeral. They dug her back up. What they found wasn't just unsettling, it was wrong on a basic, physical level. Anne's head had separated completely from her body, and the skull underneath was already bare, stripped of flesh far faster than it should have been for how long she'd actually been in the ground. They brought the skull into the hall. The disturbances stopped. They came back, though, every time anyone tried to move the skull again. Thrown in a pond once, buried in the garden another time. Both times the noise returned until it was brought back inside. Eventually, to end it for good, someone bricked the skull directly into one of the hall's interior walls. Nobody alive today knows exactly where. The household's name for Anne's restless spirit became Oud Nance, said with the kind of casual familiarity you'd use for someone who never actually left. Here's the problem with Burton Agnes as a piece of evidence. The skull is sealed inside a private, lived-in house. It's never been recovered, never examined, never tested. So the story stays exactly what it's always been, passed down, unverified, with nothing left to check it against. By the way, if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who finds the hidden side of history fascinating. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. New episode every week. Now, back to Britain's screaming skulls. Burton Agnes isn't the only house running on this exact script, though. Down in Dorset, Bettiscombe Manor has its own screaming skull, with the same basic shape of legend behind it. Dying wish. A skull that has to stay. Disturbances the second anyone tries to move it. The difference is, nobody ever bricked the Bettiscombe skull into a wall. It just sat there, in the open, generation after generation, passed down along with the house itself, available for anyone curious enough to actually look at it. So in 1963, somebody finally did. A pathologist got hold of it. Everyone assumed, based purely on the local story, that this was the skull of someone who'd lived in or near the house, maybe a century or two back, whose dying request had simply been taken a bit too literally. That assumption fell apart almost immediately. The skull turned out to be somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. Not from the house, not from the family, not even close, really, to either of those things. And it wasn't male, the way most versions of the local story had assumed. It belonged to a woman, which means the legend and the object had nothing to do with each other. Whoever this woman was, she died thousands of years before that house, that family, or honestly anything resembling modern England existed. There's a theory connecting her to Pilsden Pen, an Iron Age hill fort and ritual site not far from the manor, meaning the real explanation might be some kind of ancient burial or ritual practice that has zero connection to the dying wish ghost story everyone had been telling for generations. So here's where that leaves things. The hauntings at Bettiscombe were reported consistently, across different owners, different decades, people with no obvious reason to make the same story up independently. That part seems to be genuinely, stubbornly real. But the reason the legend gave for all of it, one specific person's specific dying request, turns out to have absolutely nothing to do with the skull that was actually sitting in that house the entire time. Somebody built an entire haunted house legend around an object thousands of years older than the story itself. And nobody knew that until a pathologist finally checked. That's roughly where all of this sits today. Houses like Burton Agnes still have their skulls somewhere behind the plaster, permanently sealed, permanently untestable, folklore frozen exactly where it's always been, with no physical evidence left to compare it against. Bettiscombe is the rare exception, the one case where someone could actually run the numbers, and the number came back almost absurdly bigger than anyone was expecting. What actually connects an Iron Age woman's skull to a Dorset farmhouse is still completely unexplained. The 1963 test answered one question, how old is this thing? And immediately opened a much bigger one nobody's answered since. How did it end up there at all? And whether the haunting people kept reporting for generations might, in some strange roundabout way, be even older than the screaming skull legend ever gave it credit for. Look around. History is everywhere. As always, see you in the past.